Every incident writes a unique narrative. Every investigation seeks objective facts. Securing your legal rights, uncovering real justice.
Sweetheart, who is this man to you?
He's my daddy.
She is my daughter, sir.
I didn't ask you. Is he telling you to say that, sweetheart?
No.
The candles were lit on the pancakes when the officer walked into the restaurant. They were two small candles, the kind you buy in a box of 20 in the party aisle at the supermarket, and they were planted on top of two stacks of pancakes at a red upholstered booth table at an IHOP in Ohio on a morning in October 2020. The girl beside the man was wearing a paper gold crown, the kind restaurants give to customers celebrating birthdays. And there was, at that table, the specific quality of a breakfast that had been planned in advance because it meant something, because there was a child who had woken up that morning knowing it was her special day and that her father had promised pancakes with candles. That scene, a father and daughter celebrating a birthday at a restaurant on a weekday morning, would be interrupted by something neither of them had planned, and that the body camera of the officer who walked through the door would capture in enough detail for the entire world to see what had happened in that red upholstered booth. The body camera had been recording since before the officer entered the restaurant. It recorded everything, as body cameras do, without discriminating between what would matter and what would not, without knowing that that specific file would become one of the most watched videos of that month in that country. The timestamp in the upper right corner marked 10:51 in the morning. It was a Friday morning. The restaurant had the typical weekday IHOP traffic, a few tables occupied, staff circulating with coffee pots, the smell of pancake batter and maple syrup that is the specific smell of that kind of place. And there was, in that environment, in a booth near the window, a gray-bearded black man and a light-haired white girl with a gold crown on her head, celebrating something that had begun that morning as the kind of memory children carry for the rest of their lives. The man's name was Robert. He was 56 years old, had retired 2 years earlier after a career as a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing company, and had adopted the girl beside him, whose name was Ayla, when she was 2 years old, after a process that had lasted 18 months and had involved home visits, psychological evaluations, court hearings, and all the steps the system places between a child and a permanent home. Ayla was turning 6 that October morning. Robert had promised her that the birthday breakfast would be special, had chosen IHOP, because Ayla had specifically requested pancakes and had arrived early enough to secure a good table before the weekend crowd. It was an ordinary Friday morning at an ordinary restaurant, and there was nothing in that scene that should have drawn anyone's attention beyond the two of them. Someone in the restaurant had called the emergency number. The call had described an adult black man with a small white child who appeared frightened and who was possibly being held against her will. That description, which the body camera and dispatch records would document with precision for subsequent analysis, had been made by someone who had looked at Robert and Ayla sitting in that booth, and had reached a conclusion about what they were seeing before verifying any fact, before asking anything, before considering any explanation beyond the one they had immediately constructed upon seeing a black man beside a white child. The conclusion had been kidnapping. And that conclusion had been enough for an officer to be dispatched to that IHOP that morning with a narrative already formed about what they would find when they arrived. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. What that body camera captured in that restaurant in Ohio is one of the most disturbing and most important recordings this channel has ever analyzed. Not for violence, because there is no physical violence in this story, but for what it reveals about the kind of assumption that can transform a birthday breakfast into a crime investigation. Hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments. Can you imagine celebrating your child's birthday when an officer walks in and asks whether the child is being forced to stay with you? Tell me down below. The body camera captured the moment the officer arrived at Robert and Ayla's table with the candles still lit on the pancakes. It captured Robert's expression when he realized what was happening, an expression any parent would recognize as the expression of someone simultaneously understanding the personal danger of the situation and the need not to let that danger manifest in a way that frightens the child beside them. It captured Ayla's expression, who at 6 years old did not fully understand what was happening, but understood enough to know that something had changed in that morning that had begun with a promise of pancakes. And it captured, with enough clarity to be transcribed and analyzed by anyone watching the video, the officer bending down toward Ayla and asking, in that specific tone used with children, when adults want information they believe the child is being prevented from giving, whether the man beside her had told her to say what she was saying. Robert had arrived at the IHOP at 10:23 that morning, according to the restaurant's point-of-sale system record that documented the time the order had been placed. He had arrived holding hands with Ayla, had asked for the booth she had pointed to near the window because from there you could see the street and Ayla liked watching cars go by while she ate, and had asked the waiter for the birthday crown that the restaurant offered to customers who were celebrating. The waiter had brought the crown, had sung happy birthday along with a colleague who had been called over to join in, and had taken a photo of the two of them on Robert's phone at his request, a photo that existed on that phone at that moment, and that documented with a simplicity no legal document could replicate what that table represented that morning. 2 smiles, a gold crown, pancakes on the way. The person who had made the emergency call was sitting 3 tables away from Robert and Ayla. They had observed the two for several minutes before picking up the phone, according to what would be reconstructed subsequently through the statements of other witnesses who were in the restaurant that morning and who had paid attention to what had happened before the police arrived. None of those witnesses had observed anything they would describe as suspicious behavior on Robert's part, or any sign that Ayla was afraid or uncomfortable. What the witnesses described was a birthday breakfast, the crown, the pancakes, the waiter singing happy birthday. One specific witness, a woman who was sitting in the booth immediately behind Robert and Ayla's, said she had heard the conversation between the two for several minutes before the officer arrived, and that what she had heard was exactly what it appeared to be: a father answering a 6-year-old's questions about what she wanted to do after breakfast. The officer who had been dispatched was Detective Sergeant Kevin Collins. He had 15 years of service, had worked on crimes against children cases for 6 of those years, and had arrived at the IHOP with the call description in his ear and with the kind of focus that professionals with that specific background develop, a focus that is valuable when a real crime exists, but that can become an obstacle when the premise orienting it is wrong. Collins had entered the restaurant with 1 additional agent, had located Robert and Ayla at the window booth in less than 10 seconds, and had walked toward them, with the posture the body camera captured as the posture of someone approaching a situation they have already classified before arriving. The candles were still lit on the pancakes when he reached the table. Collins had addressed Robert first, asking his name and requesting identification. Robert had provided both without hesitation, had removed his wallet from his pocket with deliberately slow and visible movements, had shown his driver's license. Collins had examined the document and then had done something the body camera captured, and that would become one of the most analyzed moments of the video. He had turned to Ayla. He had crouched slightly to be at her level, had adopted that specific tone of voice adults use with children when they want to appear non-threatening while obtaining information, and had begun asking questions. He had asked her name. He had asked who the man beside her was. He had asked if she was okay. And then he had asked the question the camera captured, and that appeared in the caption of the image that would become the most shared of the entire case. He had asked whether the man had told her to say what she was saying. Ayla was 6 years old and was wearing a gold birthday crown, and there were pancakes with candles in front of her. She had answered Collins' questions with the specific directness of young children who have not yet developed the layer of social filtering that adults use to soften information. She had said her own name. She had said the man beside her was her father. She had said she was okay. And when Collins had asked the question about whether her father had told her to say that, Ayla had looked at him with that expression the camera captured in detail, and that anyone who has ever interacted with 6-year-olds would immediately recognize. The expression of someone who has received a question that makes no sense to them, and who is processing why an adult would be asking something so obviously unnecessary. She had answered no, that her father had not told her to say anything, that he was her real father, and that it was her birthday. Robert had remained still during that exchange between Collins and Ayla. The body camera captured him in the background during the questions directed at his daughter, and what it captured was a containment that went beyond ordinary self-control. It was the specific containment of a black father who understands that any movement he makes at that moment, any word he says without being asked, any emotional reaction that spills over, can be interpreted in a way that worsens a situation that had already reached a level it should never have reached. He had kept his hands visible on the table, had maintained a neutral expression in the way it is possible to maintain a neutral expression when what you really want to do is pick up your 6-year-old daughter and leave that restaurant as quickly as possible. He had waited, and the camera had recorded every second of that wait with the precise indifference of a device that does not know what it is documenting but documents anyway. Collins had continued asking Ayla questions for a few more minutes after her initial response. The body camera captured that sequence with a clarity that made audible not just the words but the tone of each exchange. And what the tone communicated was something that child interview specialists who later analyzed the video would describe as an approach that had been designed, probably without deliberate awareness on Collins' part, to produce a specific response rather than discover the truth. The questions were not open-ended. They were questions that contained premises, that assumed there was something to be uncovered beyond what Ayla had already said, that treated her responses as potentially unreliable for reasons that an adult's logic could construct, but that the actual experience of that child did not support. Ayla had answered every question with the same direct consistency with which she had answered the first, because the truth she was describing was the truth she knew, and that did not change regardless of how many times or in how many different ways someone asked. Robert had asked to speak at a certain point in the interaction, and Collins had raised his hand in a gesture the camera captured as the gesture of someone signaling that it was not Robert's turn, that the conversation at that moment was with the child, and that he should wait. That gesture, of a police officer silencing a father while interrogating his 6-year-old daughter at a birthday table, had been captured by the camera with a clarity that several legal commentators would describe as the most revealing moment of the entire recording, because it concentrated in a single frame the entire imbalance of the situation. Robert had lowered his hand and had waited, and the camera had kept recording. The second agent who had arrived with Collins had been positioned in a way that Collins's camera captured in the background, and his position was the position of someone monitoring Robert while Collins conducted the interaction with Ayla. That division of attention, Collins focused on the child and the second agent monitoring Robert, was a configuration that made sense in a context where there was real reason to suspect immediate danger. But the pancakes were on the table. The crown was on Ayla's head. The waiter who had brought the crown and sung happy birthday was a few meters away and had been observed by both agents when they had entered the restaurant. There was a context in that booth that anyone arriving without formed premises would immediately recognize, and that context had been ignored in a way that the camera was documenting in real time. It was the restaurant manager who introduced the element that finally began moving the situation in a different direction. He had observed the interaction from the beginning, had initially been uncertain whether he should intervene, and had decided to approach when Collins had begun the third round of repeated questions to Ayla. The manager, a man in his mid-40s who had worked at that establishment for 12 years, had approached the table and had told Collins that he knew Robert, that he was a regular customer for years, that he came regularly with his daughter, and that there had never been any problem of any kind associated with their presence. He had said this with the specific calm of someone providing factual information they consider relevant, and who expects that information to be treated as such. Collins had listened, had thanked him for the information, and had continued with the interaction the way he had been conducting it before the manager's intervention. There were other customers in the restaurant who had been observing that scene from varying distances, and with expressions that the cameras on their own phones, which at least 3 of them had begun using discreetly since the situation had begun, captured as expressions of people who were watching something that disturbed them, but who were unsure whether they should intervene. That hesitation, which is understandable in a context where there is active police presence, had kept the other witnesses silent for a period that subsequent analysis of the timestamps of the individual recordings would estimate at approximately 8 minutes from Collins' arrival to the moment when one of the witnesses, a woman named Patricia, who had been sitting in the booth behind Robert and Ayla's since before any of the parties involved had arrived, had stood up and walked to the table. Patricia had stood up and had told Collins, with a firmness that the other customers' recordings captured with enough clarity to be transcribed, that she had arrived at the restaurant before Robert and Ayla, that she had observed everything from the beginning, that the child had arrived holding that man's hand, that both had been greeted by the waiter, who knew them by name, that she had watched the crown being placed on the girl's head and the candles being lit on the pancakes, and that what Collins was doing at that moment was not investigating a crime, but was ruining a 6-year-old child's birthday in front of that child. She had said that and then had stood there, waiting. Collins had looked at her, had looked at Robert, had looked at Ayla with the gold crown and the pancakes going cold on the table. And for the first time since he had entered that restaurant, something in his posture had changed in a way the body camera captured, but for which there was no simple word to describe beyond belated recognition. Collins asked Robert to accompany him to the area near the restaurant entrance to speak separately, away from the table where Ayla had stayed with the second agent beside her. Robert had agreed, had said a few words to Ayla before standing up, words that Collins' camera had captured with audio clear enough to be transcribed. He had told her to stay still, that he would be back in a minute, that the pancakes would be there when he came back. Ayla had looked at her father with that expression the camera had captured, and that Patricia, the witness who had stood up, would later describe as the expression of a child who does not understand what is happening, but who trusts that her father will sort it out. The specific expression of someone who has been taught over 4 years of living together that when her father says he will be back in a minute, he comes back. Near the entrance area, away from Ayla, Collins had asked the question Robert had been expecting since the officer had arrived. At the table, he had asked Robert to prove he was the girl's father. Robert had returned to his wallet, had removed a laminated card he had been carrying since the adoption process had been finalized. The adoption decree in a reduced format that attorneys who work with adoption sometimes recommend that adoptive parents of children with different phenotypic appearance from themselves carry in situations of public movement. That card existed because Robert had been advised by the attorney who had processed the adoption that situations like that one were not unlikely, that the specific combination of a black father and a white daughter in public spaces generated a kind of attention that documentation helped manage. He had heard that advice, had thought it was the kind of unnecessary precaution he hoped never to need, and had carried the card anyway because the attorney had been persuasive, and because deep down he had understood that the attorney was right. Collins had examined the document, had verified the names, had verified the date, had verified the judicial process number that was recorded on the card and that was verifiable in the court system. The examination had taken perhaps 2 minutes, during which Robert had stood with his hands visible and his gaze going periodically toward Ayla, who was visible from where they were at the table he had left, with the second agent beside her. When Collins had finished examining the document, he had paused before returning it in a way the camera captured as the pause of someone processing the distance between the narrative they had brought to the restaurant and the reality they had found. He had returned the card without immediate comment on its contents, and then he had said he needed to verify the document in the system before he could release Robert. That verification had taken 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which Robert had stood in an area near the entrance of an IHOP on a Friday morning while his 6-year-old daughter waited at a birthday booth table with a police officer beside her and cooling pancakes and candles that had already gone out. Other customers who came and went from the restaurant during those 11 minutes passed by Robert and the scene with those expressions that the phone recordings of those still inside the restaurant kept capturing in the background. The manager had returned behind the counter, but had kept his gaze in the direction of the situation. Patricia had returned to her booth, but had kept her phone in her hand, and Collins' body camera had kept recording everything, including every minute of those 11 in which Robert had stood, waiting for a system to confirm what a judicial document had already established. The verification had returned positive. The adoption decree was legitimate. The judicial process existed in the court records. Robert was legally Ayla's father, with all the rights and responsibilities that designation created under Ohio law. Collins had communicated that confirmation to Robert in language the camera captured as the language of someone who is technically acknowledging a fact without fully recognizing the implications of what that fact meant in relation to everything that had happened in the previous 23 minutes. He had said that everything was in order, that Robert was free to return to the table, and had added, almost as a postscript, that he was sorry for the inconvenience. That word, inconvenience, used to describe 23 minutes of interrogation of a father and his 6-year-old daughter at a birthday table based exclusively on the assumption that a black man could not be the father of a white child, was captured by the camera with the same fidelity with which it had captured every other word that morning. Robert had returned to the table where Ayla was waiting. Collins's camera had captured that return. Robert sitting back down in the booth, Ayla looking at her father with that expression that had been on her face the entire time he had been away. Robert had looked at the pancakes that were cold now, had looked at the candles that had gone out. had looked at the gold crown on his daughter's head that was still there because Ayla had not taken it off, and he had said something to her that the camera captured, but that the audio had not fully preserved, only the last words, which were the words any father would say in a situation like that. One, and which were also in the reading of anyone who watched the video, knowing what had happened in those 23 minutes, the most devastating words of the entire morning. He had said that everything was okay, that Daddy was here, that they could still have the birthday breakfast. The video reached the public in a way Robert had not planned and had initially not wanted. He had left the IHOP that morning with Ayla, had returned home, had tried to salvage what remained of that birthday with a second celebration attempt in the backyard with cake and the presents he had saved for that afternoon. He had put Ayla to bed that night, with the crown still on the bedside table because she had asked to keep it, and had sat in the kitchen after she fell asleep, processing that morning with the specific quality of silence that exists when an experience has been too large to fully process at the moment it happened. He had called the attorney who had handled the adoption process at 10 that night. The attorney had answered, had listened to the account, and had said 3 things in sequence that Robert would later describe as the 3 sentences that had changed the direction of what would happen next. He had said that what Robert had described was illegal. He had said there was a body camera that had recorded everything, and he had said that Robert needed to decide what he wanted to do with that. Robert had asked for time to think. It had taken 5 days. During those 5 days he had spoken with his sister, had spoken with a close friend who was a university professor, and who had experience thinking about questions of race and justice in a way Robert trusted, and had had a conversation with Ayla that had been the most difficult of the 3 because it involved trying to explain to a 6-year-old, in language a 6-year-old could process, why that morning had happened the way it had happened. Ayla had asked the question 6-year-olds ask when they do not understand something. She had asked why the police officer had thought her father was not her real father. Robert had been silent for a moment before responding. He had said that sometimes people see 2 people together and make assumptions about them before asking anything, and that those assumptions are sometimes wrong. Ayla had processed that for a few seconds, and then had asked whether the officer had apologized. Robert had said yes, that he had said he was sorry for the inconvenience. Ayla had looked at her father with that direct 6-year-old expression, and had said that was not a real apology. Robert had agreed that it was not. The decision to make the video public had been made on the 5th day, after the attorney had explained that the request for the recording needed to be made within a specific time frame, and that waiting longer created the risk of the material being overwritten or lost before it could be formally preserved. Robert had authorized the request. The recording had arrived through the appropriate legal channels. The attorney had watched the complete video, had identified the most relevant moments for a potential lawsuit, and had made a second call to Robert in which he had said that the recording was clearer than he had expected, that it documented every moment of the interaction in a way that made the reconstruction of the facts practically automatic, and that there was a strategic decision to be made about whether to release the video publicly before or after filing a formal lawsuit. Robert had chosen to release it first because he had reached the conclusion during those 5 days of processing that what had happened at that IHOP had not happened only to him, and that the utility of the video went beyond the individual lawsuit that might result from it. The video had been published on a sharing platform with a factual description of what had happened, without inflammatory language, without asking for anything specific beyond that people watch it. In 48 hours, it had accumulated more than 8 million views. The specific combination of elements in the recording, the birthday, the gold crown, the pancakes with candles, the officer's question to the 6-year-old about whether her father had told her to say what she was saying had created a resonance that transcended political and demographic divisions, that normally fragmented the audience in cases of police discrimination. There was no available ambiguity in that video, in the way there was ambiguity in other cases. There was a child with a birthday crown, and there were cooling pancakes, and there was a police officer asking whether the father had instructed his daughter to lie. The outrage had been broad, immediate, and had come from directions the police department had not anticipated when it had issued its first statement trying to frame the incident as standard procedure in response to an emergency call. The department had attempted, in the days following the publication of the video, to build a public defense based on the narrative that Collins had responded appropriately to a legitimate call and had followed standard verification protocol. That narrative had collapsed in multiple and simultaneous ways. First, because the video showed Collins continuing to question Ayla even after she had responded consistently, and even after the manager had provided additional context, which was inconsistent with any reasonable verification protocol. Second, because the existence of the adoption decree in portable format, which Robert had carried specifically because of the attorney's advice about situations like that one, made the 11-minute verification difficult to justify as necessary rather than punitive. And third, because Patricia and at least 2 other witnesses had given voluntary statements confirming what the camera showed and adding context about what had been observable in the restaurant from before Collins's arrival. Context that made it impossible to argue that any reasonable basis for initial suspicion had existed. Collins had been removed from field duties while the internal investigation was ongoing. In a decision, the department had announced with standard language about commitment to accountability and transparency. The police union had issued a statement of support for Collins that had been received with a reaction the union itself had clearly not anticipated, because the statement had used the language of operational discretion in response to a legitimate call in a context where the video made that language audible in a way that caused it to sound like a defense of something that most people who had watched the video did not consider defensible. The platforms where the video had circulated had transformed that union statement into the second most shared element of the case after the original recording, creating a juxtaposition between institutional language and the body camera images that was more effective as criticism than any additional commentary could have been. The lawsuit was filed in federal court 8 weeks after that birthday breakfast. It was a 96-page document that had been constructed with a structure that experienced attorneys in the field described as one of the most complete they had seen in cases of racial discrimination involving children, because it operated in layers that reinforced each other in a way that closed practically every exit that the defense normally uses in these cases. The first layer established the racial discrimination directly, documented by the body camera that showed the approach without observable justification and by the absence of any behavior by Robert or Ayla that could have motivated the call beyond the racial combination that had been perceived by whoever had called. The second layer argued violation of Robert's constitutional rights, specifically the protection against detention without probable cause, documented by the fact that the 11 minutes of verification had occurred after a judicial document had been presented, and its validity established before any call to the system. The third layer was the most legally innovative and was the one legal commentators had discussed with most attention. It argued specific harm to the child, that Ayla had been subjected to an interrogation conducted by a state agent during which she had been questioned in ways that presumed her father could be a criminal, and that harm was documentable and compensable independently of the harms suffered by Robert. That third layer had been constructed with the assistance of a psychologist specializing in child development and trauma, who had evaluated Ayla in the weeks after the incident and had produced a report documenting the observable effects of that morning on her behavior in the subsequent days. The report described specific changes that the psychologist had attributed, with documented clinical basis, to the experience of having her father separated from her by state agents in a situation she had perceived as threatening without fully understanding why. There were nightmares in the 3 days following the incident. There was a reluctance to accompany her father to public places that had lasted approximately 2 weeks. There were repeated questions about whether her father could be taken away again. None of those effects had been permanent, and the psychologist had documented Ayla's gradual recovery with the same precision with which he had documented the initial effects. But the documentation of the existence of those effects, even if temporary, had created a clinical basis for allegations of harm to the child that made the lawsuit significantly more complex than it would have been if only the harms to Robert were considered. The department had attempted, through its attorneys, to persuade the court that Collins had acted within the limits of qualified immunity because he had responded to an emergency call and had followed what he considered reasonable procedure given the circumstances. That defense had encountered an obstacle that would become central in every preliminary hearing. The body camera showed Collins arriving at the restaurant, locating Robert and Ayla in less than 10 seconds, and walking directly toward them without making any additional observation of the environment, without checking with any employee before approaching, without considering any alternative hypothesis to the one he had brought from the car. That behavior of someone who had arrived with a conclusion and was implementing that conclusion without the evaluationist step the law required before any action that restricted someone's freedom was precisely the behavior that the qualified immunity doctrine did not protect when there was clear evidence that established rights had been violated. The person who had made the original call to the emergency number had been identified through call records during the discovery process. She was a 63-year-old woman who had been sitting at a table 3 booths away from Robert and Ayla. She had been contacted by Robert's attorney as part of the process, had initially refused to answer questions, and had subsequently given a statement through her own attorney that was, in Robert's attorney's assessment, the most direct admission available of how the assumption had functioned. She had said she had seen the girl appear quiet and had become concerned. When asked whether the girl had seemed frightened or in danger in any specific way, she had said not exactly, that it was more of a feeling. When asked whether she had spoken with anyone in the restaurant before calling, she had said no. When asked whether she had considered that the man might be the girl's father, she had been silent for a moment before saying she had not thought of that. That statement, that she had not thought of it, was the most precise description available of the mechanism that had set everything in motion, an assumption, formed so quickly and with such certainty that the most obvious and most common possibility that an adult man accompanying a child in a restaurant might simply be her father had not made it to consideration. Collins was dismissed 5 months after the incident, after the internal investigation concluded that he had conducted the interaction in a way that violated departmental approach protocols and had prolonged Robert's detention beyond what any reasonable justification could sustain after the adoption and documentation had been presented. The union attempted the appeal it always attempts, and the appeal was denied with language the arbitrator had chosen with enough precision to be cited in civil rights organization statements in the weeks that followed. Language that said the body camera had documented not a misjudgment, but a sequence of consecutive decisions, each of which had had an available exit point and none of which had been taken. The agreement that closed the lawsuit was announced 7 months after that birthday breakfast. The financial amount was kept partially confidential, but sources close to the proceedings confirmed it was among the largest ever paid by the county in civil rights cases involving children. The non-financial conditions included complete revision of response protocols for calls involving minors, mandatory training on racial bias and on adoptive and foster families with phenotypically mixed compositions, and the creation of a review mechanism for false calls that had resulted in illegal detention, with the possibility of referral to the prosecutor's office when the discriminatory element could be established. That last condition had been the most difficult to negotiate, and had been the one Robert had defended most firmly, because he had understood from the beginning that the call that had set everything in motion had not been made by Collins, but by someone who had looked at a birthday table and had seen something that did not exist, and that as long as there were no consequences for that kind of call, the cycle that had produced that morning would continue reproducing itself in other restaurants at other tables with other fathers and other children. Robert had returned to the same IHOP with Ayla 2 months after the agreement was signed. He had chosen that restaurant deliberately, had asked for the same window booth table, had ordered the same pancakes, and had brought 2 new candles he had put in his bag before leaving home. The manager who had tried to intervene on that October morning had recognized Robert when he walked in, had walked to the table, had shaken Robert's hand, and had said something that Robert would later describe as the simplest and most necessary thing anyone had said to him throughout that entire process. The manager had said, "Welcome back." Robert had sat in the booth with Ayla, had asked the waiter for the candles, had lit both on a stack of pancakes, and had looked at his daughter. With the crown she had insisted on wearing again, because it was the same crown from last time, and she had said the birthday was not over yet. This time, the candles stayed lit until Ayla blew them out. This time, nobody walked through the door.
Integrity is a lifelong quest, and education remains your strongest asset. Thank you for tuning in and promoting institutional transparency.